Yeah. I think I got it. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, and you could look at me rather than the camera.
Okay.
So can you tell us your name and sort of your credentials?
Sure. My name is Elisa Bieria. I've been part of the anti-violence movement for over 20 years in different organizations and projects. Most recently, I've been very fortunate to be a part of this broader coalition called Survived and Punished, which is focusing on the criminalization of survivors of domestic and sexual violence, that pipeline between the experience of sexual and domestic violence into multiple forms of criminalization, and trying to explain how carceral systems like prisons and police and detention centers are integral to the experience of domestic and sexual violence for many people.
So I'd imagine that city in this country happening every day that would be an attention of your group.
Mm-hmm.
Why is Shantonio's case something that Survived and Punished has decided to focus on or think about?
Yeah, Shantonio's case, we learned about it through the organizers on the ground in Nashville. And when we read more deeply about the case, it resonated with a lot of the other cases that we've seen come through. Shantonio is being prosecuted for failure to protect. In other words, the idea of the law, it says that survivors of domestic violence have a duty to protect their children from the violence, and if they fail in that duty, then they're liable for prosecution. That is absurd, right? Because of course you're trying to navigate chaotic, horrible conditions of domestic violence, and what you're being really punished for is the inability to control the abusive person's violence against your own children. Which of course is an absurd standard that for anyone to have.
And what is it that's violence at home? What is it that they would not be understanding about Shantonio's experience as to why that policy would be so absurd?
Right. I think that there are many strategies that survivors of domestic and sexual violence use in order to protect themselves, defend themselves and their children. The problem is those strategies are very much targeted for criminalization. They are demeaned, they are distorted in court systems, and it becomes very difficult to figure out the perfect strategy to survive that wouldn't make you vulnerable to criminalization. A lot of people who look at failure to protect cases, the first thing that people say is that, well, the survivors should have left in order to make sure that their children were protected. But what happens is when survivors try to leave an abusive relationship, the risk of fatality increases pretty dramatically. We actually saw this in another case that had sort of a failure to protect philosophy in their prosecution against Kellyanne Savage here in California. She was trying to leave. She had called the domestic violence hotline. She made the plan. She was planning to leave the next day. She had left the house in order to get her stuff together. And when she came home, she realized that her batterer learned that she was trying to leave, and he tragically murdered her son. And so there's this way in which survivors are doing the best that they can to try to navigate through impossible conditions of violence and chaos. And, but they are constantly being punished and criminalized no matter what they do. If they stay, they're criminalized. If they leave, they're criminalized. If they try to fight back, they're criminalized, as we saw with Marissa Alexander's case in Florida, who was punished for self-defense. So, I think that there's a fundamental problem in the way that we are thinking about how to support survivors of domestic violence more robustly. What kinds of conditions, political and institutional conditions, do we need to make sure that survivors have what they need in order to stay safe and keep their children safe? I think it's more of a community and collective accountability in addition to the accountability of the person who actually did the violence, right?
And what is it that you think, and she's obviously she's a survivor of violence, she's a survivor of the loss of her child. I know you haven't met Shantonia. Based on your knowledge and experience, what is it that you think Shantonia needs? What would be a proper way to respond to the trauma in her life?
I mean, I think that she needs to know that she's not alone. I think that's number one. I think what happens is domestic violence disappears people, and prisons disappear people. In both kinds of institutions, violence is happening behind closed doors, behind walls. And so they end up getting lost from our radar, the community radar. And so we need to reestablish those connections. So the fact that the folks in Nashville are putting together a local defense campaign to let Shantonia know that she has not been lost, that she has not been disappeared, is a really crucial step. I think that people sending letters to Shantonia to know that that people know about her case and affirm the fact that she's being prosecuted is wrong. I've heard many times from survivors, Marissa Alexander, Nanhi Jo here in California, many others, the importance of getting letters from people because of the ways in which being prosecuted crazy makes you, right? And so you might begin to think that, well, maybe this was my fault. Maybe I could have controlled the abuser. Maybe I should be punished, which of course is all part of the experience of being abused. You start to blame yourself. And so we all need to pull together through these different kinds of strategies to connect with those survivors and disrupt that pattern of abuse that's being led by both batters and judicial systems.
And let me put a focus on what has been a blind spot for the most part. What is the message that you think would be sent to the country if the prosecutor and the DA's office did decide to continue to prosecute Shantonia at the level that they are, which is essentially a life sentence, even in the plea deals, from my understanding?
That's right.
Some crazy number.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess to streamline that, what is the message that would be sent if the DA continues down the road of prosecution of Shantonia? I'm sorry, and just say the message.
Yeah, thank you. The message that the prosecution sends to survivors is that there is no way out. There is no way out. No matter what you do, particularly if you are Black or Native or immigrant or queer and trans or poor, disabled, no matter what you do, if you are in these positions where your motherhood is seen as criminal and your survivorhood is seen as criminal, it will be ultimately punished. It shouldn't be a crime to survive, which is what's happening, right? And I think that survivors know this. I was just reading a survey yesterday that said that more than half of survivors don't call the police because they think they're gonna make it worse, which is actually, it's reasonable when you look at the relationship between criminalization and surviving domestic and sexual violence. That's completely reasonable. And so we're gonna have to try to figure out some other strategies to better support survivors of domestic violence that don't rely on criminalizing institutions, because if this is the direction of carceral institutions like courts and prosecutors, we have to come up with some other strategies. In the meantime, what I would hope is that prosecutors take a step back, look at the ways in which domestic violence is informing the entire process. The process of certainly Shantonio trying her best to make decisions about how to move through that horrible relationship. And also informing the process of her being prosecuted, right? And so there's this way in which prosecution extends the experience of domestic violence into the institution of the court system. And so the court system becomes the batterer, which, now we have a whole other, a bigger, more difficult problem to address. So court systems have a choice. They can either be against domestic violence or participate in domestic violence. And prosecuting survivors for surviving is basically colluding with domestic violence. So you have a choice.
Wow. So you covered the other side of the coin, I think, in that already. But so just for the purpose of the video, you had talked about this, but based on your experience, what you've seen, other survivors you've talked with cross-country, stories that you've followed, what are some real-life possibilities if Shantonio did call out for help around the violence subjected to her?
I think that one of the things, there are many possible strategies that we need to be pursuing. One of them, and I know I've heard this a lot from folks in the anti-violence movement, is that advocates for adult survivors and advocates for child survivors need to do more to build coalition together and talk about how to develop a more comprehensive analysis of how to keep people safe. However, that analysis, I believe, has to come with a decriminalizing sort of principle, because what's happening is that both adult survivors of domestic violence like Shantonio and child survivors of domestic violence like Brescia Meadows in Ohio are being criminalized for their experience of surviving domestic violence. And so sometimes these collaborations happen in a way that is pro-criminalization, and I think that they have to reorient their philosophy around their relationship with criminalizing institutions. The other thing is that for those of us who have been organizing and critiquing the criminal legal system, we have to make sure that we incorporate an understanding of court violence as part of this larger carceral violence phenomena, right? That's just as important, and often sometimes extremely brutal as prisons and as policing. And so I think there's something about the professionalization of courts that kind of obscures the violence that's happening within those systems. And I think that those of us who have a lot of criticism of the system need to make sure that they're looped back into this broader analysis. And the other thing I think is that we need to think about the use of defense campaigns, grassroots defense campaigns, as one strategy to pursue safety and support of survivors. I think that there's some concern that when you focus on one survivor, Shantonio or Marissa or whoever, that kind of elevates that survivor over other survivors whose names we don't know. But in my experience, what I've learned is that people are able to connect with individuals whose names they know, whose stories they know, and then that facilitates, it catalyzes an opportunity for us to talk about the problem more systemically and to help us learn about more survivors, right? And so I started off, I knew the statistics, but I started off in this work in the Free Marissa Now mobilization campaign, which is to free Marissa Alexander. And through that experience, that's how I've learned about Shantonio Hunter, and Brescia Meadows, and Kellyanne Savage, and Nanhee Jo, and Tindalea Hall in Oklahoma, who's also being prosecuted for failure to protect. I think that there's this way in which we start to understand in a richer, more multidimensional way how pervasive this problem of criminalization is. And so I think there's a lot of use in defense campaigns, and I think that they can take on a number of different kinds of forms. Such as, I think that the bailout day for Mother's Day is a kind of defense campaign strategy, right? Where we can't sort of eliminate the bail system in one day, but what we can do is this crucial intervention to raise awareness about the injustice of the system. And that's essentially the same philosophy as defense campaigns.
That's great.
Yeah.
I feel...
So, Shantonio Hunter is a 25-year-old black mother who has been forced to grieve the death of her son behind bars for 4 years before a trial has even begun. There is something very specific about the history of racialized reproductive violence that leaves black mothers vulnerable to this kind of constant gratuitous punishment that we see in Shantonio's case and in so many other cases. Another example is Tindalea Hall's case in Oklahoma, where her batterer, who again tragically hurt her child, was given 2.5 years, I think, prison time, and so which was already time served. And so when he was sentenced, with the plea deal, he was able to walk out, and she was given 30 years in prison. And one of the arguments that the prosecutor made is that Tindalea was more culpable because she's a mother, not because of what she did, but because she's a mother. And so there's this very specific way in which mothers in general, but I think a specific way in which black mothers in particular are targeted for violence and punishment and criminalization that Shantonio Hunter's case reflects. And it's something that we have to disrupt.
Thank you. That was great. I was glad.
Okay.
You framed it that way too, of black mothers.
Yeah, I'll take I could do a couple.
Then maybe just one of...
Like a photograph?
So we call this the, you'll probably end up laughing, but we call this the Master Blaster shot.
Okay.
So I probably ruined whatever series.
Right. So, okay. Let me get that look.
Basically, you're looking into the camera. It's actually gonna be video, not photo.
Yeah.
But we sort of layer it sometimes over the beginning or the end of an interview, and has a nice effect.
Yeah.
And sometimes sure,
you could count it up.
Okay. So just for 10 seconds, so you could
just look in the lens.
Just look in there.
Okay.
Think about Shantonio and your message and your work. Can I take a photo and put it on the interweb of that free Shantonio?
Sure.
So now I'm taking a picture of your picture. Justice conference like last month, and he's got some PR thing going.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
Sorry, I'm just getting B-roll.
you never say when jeans.
Absolutely.
We should definitely do it.
Yes, please connect.
Okay.
Okay,
Have
cool.
a good.